Hello everyone, welcome to the second class on the play Trifles by Susan Glaspell, published in 1916. In the first class, we had a discussion on the summary and the characters of the play. In this class, we'll try to delve into a detailed analysis of the play as to what extent this play can be considered as a piece of feminist literature. Myself, Arun Kumar CS. I teach at the Department of English, Government College, Manandawadi. As you already know, Trifles is part of the course Women's Writings for 5th semester BA English, Kannur University. We have already had a discussion on the plot of the play. We said that basically this play is a detective story narrated primarily by the two women, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, in the kitchen. So the major part of the action happens in the kitchen, and they confine themselves in the kitchen and analyze the evidences. And these evidences, and what are these evidences? These evidences are a quilt, the bird cage, the dead bird, etc. So these evidences are dismissed and overlooked by the men who represent the legal system as insignificant or as trifles. And the title of the play, Trifles, it conveys the irony and also the challenge against men's notion, a patriarchal notion that women's lives and women's concerns and their interests, their identities are trifles, insignificant, unimportant, and silly, small, trivial, and inconsequential. So there are two kinds of narrations going on in the play about the same crime. Mrs. Wright has been arrested for the murder of her husband, Mr. John Wright. So there are two narrations, one by the county attorney, the sheriff, and basically by the men who represent the legal system. The other narration, which is more authentic, which is more convincing and more comprehensive, is carried out by the two women characters, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. So the women's perspective, which is formed on the basis of very convincing evidences such as the bird cage, the dead body of the bird, etc. So this is altogether dismissed by men as trifles. So this perspective is more logical and it is more comprehensive, and also this perspective challenges, it poses great challenge to the idea of victim and murderer. So the play is asking very disturbing questions, and also the play is problematizing the idea of victim and the murderer. So even the idea of a crime and the crime scene does not really exist in the play, because what has been done is not a crime but an act of justice, as we can see. And one important element in the play is the idea of space. Most of the action happen in the kitchen, that is a space in the house that is supposed to be quote unquote very feminine, or the space that belonged to the female. So altogether the play challenges the notion that home is a space of security and safety. So by the time the play comes to the end, the audience sort of they get the idea that home is not a very soothing place to be in. It can be a very devastating experience for the women folk. Also, there is very much this gendered divisions of space is something that we can see from the play. For example, there is this idea of public space and also private space, paralleled by the exposure of men and the alienation of women. In the play, Mr. John Wright is a public figure. He goes out to the town, he meets with people, and everybody has a good opinion. And Mrs. Hale admits that everybody had a very good opinion of Mr. Wright. He was a good man. But she also admits at that point that he was a very difficult man to live with. That is a completely different thing. But at the same time, while Mr. John Wright was having a time, some kind of exposure outside the domestic space, we know that Mrs. Wright, Minnie Foster, was forcefully confined to the inner spaces of the home. She was not allowed to go out in one way or the other. So the space is divided in terms of gender, as we can see in the play. Home and kitchen are the spaces of women, and men are people who go out and they occupy the public spaces. So women are not really given the entrance to the public spaces. Minnie Foster, she had once this opportunity of this privilege, this occupying this public space while she was having this career as a singer, as a leading singer, as part of the choir. Now then she made public performances. She was a star and she was some sort of a celebrity at that point of time. But then after marriage, what happened to her was this alienation and this confinement, and also this sort of imprisonment into the interior spaces of her home. So space is divided very sharply in terms of gender, or rather we can say there is gendered divisions of space, as we can see from the play. And also home is a space of home is not a very nice place to be in. We do not get a very good image of a home. For example, if you have read the various poems of Kamala Das, we get a very nice, nostalgic, memorable, soothing experience and memory of home. But this idea of home is very different in this play. Home is a place, and it is a space of abuse, continuous psychological abuse and exploitation. So this the opening scene of the play, which is a very shabby kitchen, dishes, unwashed dishes scattered here and there, and there is a very shabby and very dirty towel, it's laying somewhere, and all this scattered objects here and there, and these things represent the very psychological condition of the person who occupy that particular space, which is Mrs. John Wright. So so this shabby kitchen is representative of her own self and her own identity. So women are confined to the kitchen and men go all over the house, is what happens in the play. So the two women, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they are confined to the kitchen. They carry out their conversations inside the kitchen, and it is it is there that they found the important pieces of evidences, such as the bird cage and the bird. And men, they ignore the kitchen, they ignore whatever evidences they could have found from there, and rather they chose to go to other places of the house, and they do not see the point. And also it is very significant that the action happens in winter. The season is winter. So winter, as we already know, it stands for barrenness, it stands for lifelessness. So winter, the idea of winter, that parallels Mrs. Wright's lifelessness, her lonely situation in life, and also her, to a certain extent, to her childlessness and the barrenness in her life that she is going through. And also, interestingly, Mrs. Wright, at one point of time, she is making a request for an apron in jail. While she is in jail, she is asking for an apron. So what is the significance of apron? So it is obvious that she does not have any purpose with an apron in jail. It doesn't serve any purpose there. But then she is this apron is very much part of her self, that because it is a very naturalized symbol of imprisonment in home. So home is becoming a natural system of imprisonment. So even while she is in a prison, she wants to be wearing this apron, because that is part of her natural self, or her natural identity of being a prisoner. And also there is a quilt and bird cage. They are also powerful symbols in the play. We'll discuss them at a later point. So the whole play is depicted as a battle of sexes. On the one hand, we have male characters such as the attorney and the sheriff, and also Mr. Hale, who is a neighboring farmer. So these people are after the truth. They are going after the real motive behind the murder. But on the other hand, we have Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, who get to the point in actuality. They actually solve the mystery of the case. They find the bird cage, they find the dead body of the bird, and their analysis is not very much quote unquote logical, but that is empathetic, and it is morally valid. So we can see that it is more authentic, it is more comprehensive, and it is more convincing. So in that ways, there are two narrations are going on in this play parallel to each other regarding the mystery and the motive behind the murder of Mr. John Wright. And when we discuss the characters one by one, there is sheriff and there is county attorney. So both these characters are men, and they represent the law, and also they represent this man-like, this masculine features of the legal system, by which they completely ignore the kitchen space, because legal system and as men, they do not care about the kitchen, because kitchen is a feminine space, and it is a space of women, and it is a space of silly objects, trifles, and they ignore the kitchen because they had various preconceived notions about women and their insignificance. So sheriff says about various kinds of objects scattered here and there in the kitchen. He says nothing here but kitchen things. But the audience would know that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they find out, they get to the bird cage, and they also see the dead body of the bird concealed in a box. These are very convincing evidences, and they discover these items from the kitchen. So ignoring the kitchen was a very it was a grave mistake that the masculine legal system of the play commits. And these two characters, sheriff and attorney, they dismiss from the very onset of the play, they dismiss Mrs. Wright as a very bad housekeeper, because these objects are unwashed dishes and towels and bread. All these things are scattered here and there. The whole place looks shabby and unkempt. So they made remarks suggesting that she was a very bad housekeeper. So that is a very superior kind of an attitude, and these characters are very very patronizing about the way the whole business, the whole home business was carried out by Mrs. Wright. And also their attitude to the quilt is also very patronizing, and they dismiss the quilt as mere trifle. But we also know that the audience would, or the readers would know, that quilt is a very powerful symbol, and quilt was actually the key to the mystery behind the motive of the crime. Also, there is Mr. Wright, who is, although he is not physically present in the play, he is very much present because of his absence. So he is a character, a male character, who stands for the patriarchal order of family. And we know that he was not a very friendly person. He was not a very sociable type. He was a lonesome man, and he kind of craved for aloofness and silence. And this is confirmed with Mr. Hale, who says that Mr. Wright refused to have a telephone line at home, and he said that folks talked too much anyway. So which means he was not a person who would have liked to talk too much, or talk much, or even to talk. So he was not very sociable. He had kind of built a fortress around himself, and he was shutting himself inside that fortress along with his wife from the outside world. And we know that he kills the canary because and he must have been very, very possessive about his wife, and he could not even bear this idea of his wife having some kind of connections with the outside world. So he kills the canary because canary was part of his wife's personality, his wife's aspirations, his wife's self, which did not belong to him. So he was this sole owner. He was a sole. He had the privilege of possessing a wife such as Mrs. Wright. So if there was some part of his wife that was escaping his ownership, it disturbed him, and for that reason he kills the canary, because canary was something that was that was part of his wife that he could not claim. So he was this perpetrator of systematic psychological abuse against his wife for his refusal to get her connections, get her any linking with the outside world, and they had this lax of visits in the neighborhood. Nobody visited them, and they did not visit anybody else. So all these things were part of this this continuous psychological abuse and violence against his wife. And even the idea of his murder is questioned, and it is problematized in this play, because we ask this question whether it was a murder or whether it was an act of justice through a protest and challenge from the oppressed, who was Mrs. Wright. Although also there are two more characters, two more women characters in the play, who are Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Hale is the wife of Mr. Hale, who is a farmer, who is a neighboring farmer, and Mrs. Peters is the wife of Mr. Peters, who is a sheriff. So initially, when the play begins, these two characters, they remain apart and they remain strangers. And when the sheriff and the attorney, when they start making bad comments, very bad comments about Mrs. Wright, about her housekeeping skills, saying that she was a very bad housekeeper, things like that, these two women, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they come closer and they stand together. So initially they stand apart at the corner of the stage, but later they come to the center and they occupy the center of the stage, and they go through evidences such as the bird cage and the dead body of the bird, things like that, and they make out various conclusions, various inferences out of these evidences, and so-called, quote unquote, piece them together like the quilt. So they discover a quilt, and like in the same manner in which a quilt is pieced together by various cloth pieces, they link and they connect various evidences from that they got from the kitchen, and they piece them together, and they make a very comprehensive story, which is the real reason why Mrs. Wright commits the murder. And men in the play, as we have already seen, men represent the legal system. So women, on the other hand, they discover evidences and replace the law with justice. So men are going after evidences as per the legal system. They are concerned only about who committed the murder and things like that, or how somebody committed the murder. But then and also they are after the reason also. But then the women, as we can see, are more empathetic towards the victim, which is Mrs. Wright in their perception. So they replace the law with this idea of justice. Also, it is significant that they chose to be silent about the truth. They, in their analysis and in their conversations with each other, they come to know about the truth of the crime, about the real motive of the crime. So, but then they choose to be silent about it. They are not ready to share this with their husbands nor with the attorney. So this is an act of subversion. This is an act of subversion of the men's practice of making women silent and denying them speech. So they choose to be silent in order to thwart the kind of conclusions that men finally get themselves into. And these two women characters, they stand for Mrs. Wright, although they might not have been a very close friend of Mrs. Wright. They stand for Mrs. Wright in support and in solidarity. So all this suggests some kind of a sisterhood, some kind of a common thread among women. That's called this feminist essentialism, irrespective of class or race as Mrs. Hale, we all go through the same things. We all go through the same things. She also suggests that we go through the different forms of the same thing basically. So irrespective of whether you belong to the higher classes, or you belong to the white race, or you belong to the black race, so irrespective of all these differences, all these class, race, caste differences, there is a common suffering that all women of the world go through, is one conclusion that this play is trying to make out. And also the central character perhaps of the play is Mrs. Wright, and she is the only woman character with a name. The other two characters are Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. We do not know their names. They are named after their husbands, or they are called after their husbands. But then Mrs. Wright is the only character with a name for her own, which is Minnie Foster. So there is a significance of the names also, because Minnie in the German tongue means love, and Foster, as we know, it means to care for, it means to nurture. And also Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, Wright remains one of the word right, R-I-G-H-T, the actual, the suitable, the appropriate, the right man for Minnie was perhaps, and in that kind of a marriage, she had no rights in that kind of a marriage. So he was in no way the right man for Minnie, and Minnie had never a right man, and she had no rights as well. So she is very much present in the play by her absence. So the absence of Minnie is also significant in the play. The absence of Minnie is that goes parallel with the invisibility of her, the invisibility of women in patriarchy. So she was invisible even before she murders her husband, is one amazing conclusion that one can draw from the play, because she had no place of her own, she had no connections with the outside world, she had no friends, she had no children, and she was all alone. But before the wedding, before she got herself into a married life, she was a different personality. She was a leading singer, she was part of the choir, she was this sweet and nice young woman in the neighborhood, and everybody knew her, and she was famous, she was energetic, she was dynamic, all these things. So from that kind of a life, when she got into this married life, she moved from the peak of visibility to the depths of invisibility. So we also know that Mrs. Wright is one character that raises protest and challenge against patriarchy at a point of time when she could not bear it anymore. So murder is, again, like I said, murder is presented in the play not as an act of crime, not as an act of passion, but an act of justice. Crime is one central idea in the play, because the whole play is kind of is one type of a detective story in which two teams, one team of men and the other team of women, both the teams are going in search of the truth behind one murder committed by a woman. So this is basically a crime story. So men are very much rigid and they are not ready to change. They are inflexible about about reading this crime as a crime of passion, a crime of absolute violence. So they are interested only in the legal aspects of the event. So they make only a theoretical and legal reading of the event. So it is the women who get into and who delve deeper into the ethical questions involved in the crime. Why Mrs. Wright committed the crime, why Mr. Wright was murdered like this, why was there a bird cage, why was there a dead body of the bird, and what was the nature of their married life, and who was the real victim in the married life. These questions appear only to the women characters, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, as we can see from the play. So what is crime? Even the definition of crime is different for men and women. For women, especially for Mrs. Hale, crime is not visiting her is a crime. Not visiting Mrs. Wright was a crime that Mrs. Hale has committed. As she herself says, who is going to punish that? She is asking in the play, I never visited Mrs. Wright. It was my fault. I should have visited. It was my responsibility as a woman to visit Mrs. Wright and share her experiences, her domestic experiences, her marital experiences, her happiness and her sadness. It was my duty to meet her and share all these things, which I did not do. I did not perform that duty. So I have committed a crime, she says, and who is going to punish that? So this is the definition of crime for women. But on the other hand, for men, crime is something that figures only in the legal system, in the legal terminologies and in the legal definition, as to somebody murdered somebody else. And this why question, why somebody did that, for men it is only a technical issue, it is only a theoretical issue in order to prove the crime. It is not a question of humanity, it is not a question of responsibility, it is not a question of ethics as far as the men are concerned. So crime, as far as the women are concerned, crime is avoiding, not performing the moral responsibility of sharing the spirit of sisterhood among the oppressed. So who are the oppressed class? Who are the oppressed section in the play? The women are the oppressed section in the play. So all the women have a moral responsibility to share their sympathies, to show their sympathies with similar women of the same suffering. So crime is defined as avoiding this moral responsibility, not doing this moral responsibility of sharing this sympathy and sharing this empathy with other women of same suffering. And this play has very powerful symbols, as we can see. So the two symbols that we consider now are the quilt and also the bird. Also this bird cage, as well as the killing of the bird, all these are part of this symbolic significance. So the quilt the quilt in the play is not a completed one. It is a half finished one, and it is not even a well finished one. So Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they discover that some of the knots of the quilt they are not well stitched, they are not done properly. So they infer that Mrs. Wright might not have been feeling okay. She was feeling nervous when she was tying the knots. So the quilt, this half finished job, that suggests the incomplete life and the loneliness of Mrs. Wright. So At the same time, the other two women, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, they come together, they come closer, and they piece together the various cloth pieces of the quilt. So it says in the play, the piecing together of the quilt by the two women. So this is a the construction of their women-centered narrative, a narrative in which they favor and they see the perspective of Mrs. Wright. So that kind of a narrative they construct by putting so many things together, by putting the bird cage, by putting the dead body of the bird, by putting so many other connections together. They make a very authentic and convincing story. So the quilt and the piecing together of the quilt is standing for the linking and the construction of a woman-centered narrative, the real motive behind the murder. And also this piecing together is a bonding. So that bonding is the bonding that exists among the women folk, among a sisterhood, and also a solidarity, and also a support that all women extend for all the others who suffer. So also another significance of quilt is that quilting is conventionally, this is a group activity. All the women of a particular household, they come together, they bring pieces of cloths and they quilt as a group. So Mrs. Wright was doing it alone. She was all alone and nobody else was there to share the job with her. So that in that sense it stands for her loneliness. And also what happens in quilt making is that we piece together cloth pieces in the form of squares. So in the form of different squares or even triangles. So there are various shapes, especially squares, and these squares signify, this squares in the quilt, they signify her imprisonment. This is a very impressive kind of a reading that one can draw from the play. So the squares of the quilt stand for, they signify and they symbolize the imprisonment of her married life, the trapped situation of her married life, the unhappy imprisonment of her married life is represented by the squares in the quilt. Another powerful symbol is the bird cage and also as well as the bird. So the bird cage and the bird are very much symbolic. It's a very, very clear one. It's a very obvious one. It is very much symbolic of Mrs. Wright's self and her imprisonment in married life. So we know that at 30 years ago, Mrs. Wright did not exist. Then Minnie Foster was a leading singer. She was a celebrity. She was a dynamic, enthusiastic figure out there having a good time, a famous time, a popular time in public. So that kind of a personality, that kind of a figure Minnie Foster was. And she and Mrs. Hale is kind of wondering, she's expressing her shock and surprise by saying how she did change. So the married life has changed her completely, and she has become a completely mute, a completely still and silent person. So this complete alienation of the women is represented, is what happened really in the play. So this bird is very much symbolic of some kind of an extended identity of Minnie Foster. So by keeping a bird, Minnie Foster believed, she must have believed that some part of her unfulfilled dreams, or rather the kind of dreams that she had once and the kind of aspirations that perished in her married life. They had their own life, they existed, and they so those aspirations lived on in the form of a bird. So it was very much a part of Mrs. Wright's character, Mrs. Wright's self, shall we say. So the bird was very much symbolic of Mrs. Wright's self itself, and the bird cage, it symbolized her imprisonment in married life. The bird also had other relevance in the play, as being some kind of it occupied the place of a child that Mrs. Wright never had, and also a singing child, an extended form of herself and a person she once was. So the bird was simultaneously a part of herself, a part of her existence, and at the same time it stood for her child as well. So the killing of the bird was the most cruel act that she could imagine. So the killing of the bird that stands for the violence imposed upon women, the forceful acts of violence and cruelty and psychological trauma that are imposed upon the women. And also the killing is the loss of life, and also this loss of identity and imposed alienation of women. So all these things, all these various myriads of layers of meanings are conveyed by these two powerful symbols in the play, as we can see very clearly. So this is very much the play, and also we have had a discussion on the plot of the play, the characters, and the male characters and the female characters, and also the symbolic significance of the play. So I think this is asking so many questions concerning the idea of justice, the notion of criminality, and it problematizes so many things and so many notions like that. And also, most importantly, this is a very powerful challenge against the male notion about the insignificance of women's lives as mere trifles, and women's concerns as mere trifles and insignificant and important. So these notions are completely thwarted and devastated by the title of the play. So the title is a challenge, and as well as the title is an irony at the same time. So I hope this play is very much clear to you by now. Thank you so much.